vengeance. He had forgiven me for saying I scorned him and his love, but he had not forgotten the words, and as long as he and I lived, he never would forget them. I saw by his look, when he turned to me, that they were always written on the air between me and him. Whenever I spoke, they sounded in my voice to his ear, and their echo toned every answer he gave me. He did not abstain from conversing with me. He even called me, as usual, each morning, to join him at his desk, and I fear the corrupt man within him had a pleasure unimparted too, and unshared by the pure Christian in evincing with what skill he could, while acting and speaking apparently just as usual, extract from every deed and every phrase the spirit of interest and approval which had formerly communicated a certain austere charm to his language and manner. To me, he was in reality become no longer flesh, but marble. His eye was a cold, bright blue gem, his tongue a speaking instrument, nothing more. All this was torture to me, refined, lingering torture. It kept up a slow fire of indignation and a trembling trouble of grief, which harassed and crushed me altogether. I felt how, if I were his wife, this good man, pure as the deep sunless source, could soon kill me, without drawing from my veins a single drop of blood, or receiving on his own crystal conscience the faintest stain of crime. Especially I felt this when I made any attempt to appropriate him. No Ruth met Ruth. He experienced no suffering from estrangement, no yearning after reconciliation, and though more than once my fast-falling tears blistered the page over which we both went, they produced no more effect on him than if his heart had been really a matter of stone or metal. To his sisters, meantime, he was somewhat kinder than usual, as if afraid the mere coldness would not sufficiently convince me how completely I was banished and banned. He added the force of contrast, and this, I am sure, he did not by malice, but on principle. The night before he left home, happening to see him walking in the garden about sunset, and remembering, as I looked at him, that this man, alienated as he now was, had once saved my life, and that we were near relations, I was moved to make a last attempt to regain friendship. I went out and approached him as he stood, leaning over the little gate. I spoke to the point at once. "St. John, I am unhappy because you are still angry with me. Let us be friends." "I hope we are friends," was the unmoved reply, while he still watched the rising of the moon, which had been contemplating as I approached. "No, St. John, we are not friends as we were. You know that." "Are we not? That is wrong. For my part, I wish you no ill, and all good." "I believe you, St. John, for I am sure you are incapable of wishing anyone ill. But, as I am your kinswoman, I should desire somewhat more of affection than that sort of general philanthropy you extend to mere strangers." "Of course," he said, "your wish is reasonable, and I am far more from regarding you as a stranger." This, spoken in a cool, tranquil tone, was mortifying and baffling enough. Had I attended to the suggestions of pride and ire, I should immediately have left him, but something worked within me more strongly than those feelings could. I deeply venerated my cousin's talent and principle. His friendship was of value to me. To lose it tried me severely. I would not so soon relinquish the attempt to reconquer it. "Must we part in this way, St. John? And when you go to India, will you leave me so, without a kinder word than you have yet spoken?" He now turned quite from the moon and faced me. When I go to India, Jane, will I leave you? What? Do you not go to India? You said I could not unless I married you, and you will not marry me. You adhere to that resolution. Reader, do you know, as I do, what terror those cold people can put into the ice of their questions? How much of the fall of the avalanche is in their anger, of the breaking up of the frozen sea in their displeasure? No, St. John, I will not marry you. I adhere to my resolution. The avalanche had shaken and slid a little forward, but it did not yet crash down. Once more, why this refusal? He asked. Formerly, I answered, because you did not love me. Now, I reply, because you almost hate me. If I were to marry you, you would kill me. You are killing me now. His lips and cheeks turned white, quite white. I should kill you. I am killing you. Your words are such as ought not to be used, violent, unfeminine, and untrue. They betray an unfortunate state of mind. They merit severe reproof. They would seem inexcusable. But that it is the duty of a man to forgive his fellow, even until 77 times. I had finished the business now, while earnestly wishing to erase from his mind the trace of my former offence. I had stamped on that tenacious surface another and far deeper impression. I had burnt it in. Now you will indeed hate me, I said. It is useless to attempt to conciliate you. I see I have made an external enemy of you. A fresh wrong did these words inflict, the worse because they touched on the truth. That bloodless lip quivered to a temporary spasm. I knew that steely ire I had whetted. I was heart-wrung. You utterly misinterpret my words, I said, at once seizing his hand. I have no intention to grieve or pain you. Indeed, I have not. Most bitterly he smiled. Most decidedly he withdrew his hand from mine. And you now recall your promise, and will not go to India at all, I presume, he said, after a considerable pause. Yes, I will, as your assistant, I answered. A very long silence succeeded. What struggle there was in him between nature and grace in this interval, I cannot tell. Only singular gleams scintillated in his eyes, and strange shadows passed over his face. He spoke at last. I before proved to you the absurdity of a single woman of your age proposing to accompany abroad a single man of mine. I proved it to you in such terms as, I should have thought, would have prevented your ever again alluding to the plan. That you have done so, I regret, for your sake. I interrupted him. Anything like a tangible reproach gave me courage at once. Keep it to common sense, St. John. You are verging on nonsense. You pretend to be shocked by what I have said. You are not really shocked, for with your superior mind, you cannot be either so dull or so conceited as to misunderstand my meaning. I say again, I will be your curate, if you like, but never your wife. Again he turned lividly pale, but, as before, controlled his passion perfectly. He answered emphatically, but calmly. A female curate, who is not my wife, would never suit me. With me, then, it seems, you cannot go. But, if you are sincere in your offer, I will, while in town, speak to a married missionary, whose wife needs a coadjutor. Your own fortune will make you independent of the Society's aid, and thus you may still be spared the dishonour of breaking your promise and deserting the band you engaged to join. Now, I never had, as the reader knows, either given any formal promise or entered into any engagement, and this language was all too much, too hard, and much too despotic for the occasion. It was true. I confessed it by silence. Are you going to seek Mr. Rochester? I must find out what has become of him. It remains for me then, he said, to remember you in my prayers, and to entreat God for you, in all earnestness, that you may not indeed become a castaway. I had thought I recognized in you one of the chosen, but God sees not as man sees. His will be done. He opened the gate, passed through it, and strayed away down the glen. He was soon out of sight. On re-entering the parlour, I found Diana standing at the window, looking very thoughtful. Diana was a great deal taller than I. She put her hand on my shoulder, and, stooping, examined my face. "Jane," she said, "you are always agitated and pale now. I am sure there is something the matter. Tell me what business St. John and you have on hand. I've watched you this half hour from the window. You must forgive my being such a spy, but for a long time I have fancied I hardly know what. St. John is a strange being." She paused. I did not speak. Soon she resumed. "That brother of mine cherishes peculiar views of some sort respecting you, I am sure. He has long distinguished you by a notice and interest he never showed to anyone else. To what end? I wish he loved you. Does he, Jane?" I put her cool hand to my hot forehead. "No, Di, not one whit." "Then why does he follow you so with his eyes, and get you so frequently alone with him, and keep you so continually at his side? Mary and I had both concluded he wished you to marry him." "He does. He has asked me to be his wife." Diana clapped her hands. "That is just what we hoped and thought. And you will marry him, Jane, won't you? And then he will stay in England." "Far from that, Diana. His sole idea in proposing to me is to procure a fitting fellow labourer in his Indian toils." "What? He wishes you to go to India?" "Yes." "Madness!" she exclaimed. "You would not live 3 months there, I am certain. You shall never go. You have not consented, have you, Jane?" "I have refused to marry him." "And you have consequently displeased him," she suggested. "Deeply. He will never forgive me, I fear. Yet I offered to accompany him as his sister." "It was frantic folly to do so, Jane. Think of the task you undertook, and of incessant fatigue, where fatigue kills even the strong, and you are weak. St. John, you know him, would urge you to impossibilities. With him there would be no permission to rest during the hot hours, and unfortunately, I have noticed, whatever he exacts, you force yourself to perform. I am astonished you found courage to refuse his hand. You do not love him, then, Jane?" "Not as a husband. Yet he is a handsome fellow, and I am so plain, you see, Di. He should never suit. Plain? You? Not at all. You are much too pretty, as well as too good, to be grilled alive in Calcutta." And again she earnestly conjured me to give up all thoughts of going out with her brother. "I must indeed," I said, for when, just now, I repeated the offer of serving him as a deacon, he expressed himself shocked at my want of decency. He seemed to think I had committed an impropriety in proposing to accompany him unmarried, as if I had not from the first hoped to find in him a brother, and habitually regarded him as such. "What makes you say he does not love you, Jane?" "You should hear himself on the subject. He has again and again explained that it is not himself, but his office he wishes to mate. He has told me I am formed for labour, not for love, which is true, no doubt. But, in my opinion, if I am not formed for love, it follows that I am not formed for marriage. Would it not be strange, Di, to be chained for life to a man who regarded one but as a useful tool? Insupportable, unnatural, out of the question. And then, I continued, though I have only affection for him now, yet, if forced to be his wife, I can imagine the possibility of conceiving an inevitable, strange, torturing kind of love for him, because he is so talented, and there is often a certain heroic grandeur in his look, manner, and conversation. In that case, my lot would become unspeakably wretched. He would not want me to love him, and if I showed the feeling, he would make me sensible that I was superfluity, unrequired by him, unbecoming in me. I know he would. And yet St. John is a good man, said Diana. He is a good and a great man, but he forgets piteously the feelings and claims of little people in pursuing his own large views. It is better, therefore, for the insignificant to keep out of his way, lest, in his progress, he should trample them down. Here he comes. I will leave you, Diana. And I hastened upstairs as I saw him entering the garden. But I was forced to meet him again at supper. During that meal, he appeared just as composed as usual. I had thought he would hardly speak to me, and I was certain he had given up his pursuit of his matrimonial scheme. The sequel showed I was mistaken on both points. He addressed me precisely in his ordinary manner, or what had of late been his ordinary manner, one scrupulously polite. For the evening reader before prayers, he selected the 21st chapter of Revelation. The prayer over, we took leave of him. He was to go at a very early hour in the morning. Diana and Mary, having kissed him, left the room, in compliance, I think, with a whispered hint from him. I tendered my hand and wished him a pleasant journey. Thank you, Jane. As I said, I shall return from Cambridge in a fortnight. That space, then, yet left you for reflection. If I listened to human pride, I would say no more to you of marriage with me. But I listen to my duty, and keep steadily in view my first aim, to do all things to the glory of God. My master was long-suffering, so will I be. I cannot give you up to perdition as a vessel of wrath. Repent, resolve, while there is yet time. Remember, we are bid to work while it is day, warned that night cometh when no man shall work. Remember the fate of Dives, who had his good things in life. God give you strength to choose that better part which shall not be taken from you. He laid his hand on my head as he uttered the last words. He had spoken earnestly, mildly. His look was not, indeed, that of a lover beholding his mistress, but it was that of a pastor recalling his wandering sheep, or better, of a guardian angel watching the soul for which he is responsible. All men of talent, whether they be men of feeling or not, whether they be zealots or aspirants or despots, provided only they be sincere, have their sublime moments when they subdue and rule. I felt veneration for St. John, veneration so strong that it is impetuous thrust at me at once to the point I had so long shunned. I was tempted to cease struggling with him, to rush down the torrent of his will into the gulf of his existence, and there lose my own. I was almost as hard beset by him now as I had been once before, in a different way, by another. I was a fool both times. To have yielded then would have been an error of principle. To have yielded now would have been an error of judgment. So, I think at this hour, when I look back to the crisis through the quiet medium of time, I was unconscious of folly at the instant. I stood motionless under my hierophant's touch. My refusals were forgotten, my fears overcome, my restings paralyzed. The impossible, that is, my marriage with St. John, was fast becoming the possible. All was changing utterly with a sudden sweep. Religion called, angels beckoned, God commanded, life rolled together like a scroll. John's wrath, I grew pliant, as a reed under his kindness. Yet I knew all the time, if I yielded now, I should not the less be made to repent some day of my former rebellion. His nature was not changed by 1 hour of solemn prayer. It was only elevated. I could decide if I were but certain, I answered. Were I but convinced that it is God's will I should marry you, I could vow to marry you here and now. Come afterwards, what would? My prayers are heard, ejaculated St. John. He pressed his hand firmer on my head, as if he claimed me. He surrounded me with his arm, almost as if he loved me. I say almost. I knew the difference, for I had felt what it was to be loved. But, like him, I had now put love out of the question, and thought only of duty. I contended with my inward dimness of vision, before which clouds yet rolled. I sincerely, deeply, fervently longed to do what was right, and only that. Show me the path. I entreated of heaven. I was excited more than I had ever been, and whether what followed was the effect of excitement, the reader shall judge. All the house was still, for I believe all, except St. John and myself, were now retired to rest. The candle was dying out. The room was full of moonlight. My heart beat fast and thick. I heard its throb. Suddenly it stood still, to an inexpressible feeling that thrilled it through and passed at once to my head and extremities. The feeling was not like an electric shock, but it was quite as sharp, as strange, as startling. It acted on my senses, as if their utmost activity hitherto had been but torpor, from which they were summoned and forced to wake. They rose expectant. Eye and ear waited, while the flesh quivered in my bones. What have you heard? What do you see? Asked St. John. I saw nothing, but I heard a voice somewhere cry, Jane, Jane, Jane. Nothing more. Oh God, what is it? I gasped. I might have said, where is it? For it did not seem in the room, nor in the house, nor in the garden. It did not come out of the air, nor from under the earth, nor from overhead. I had heard it, where and whence, forever impossible to know, and it was the voice of a human being, a known, loved, well-remembered voice, that of Edward Fairfax Rochester, and it spoke in pain and woe, wildly and eagerly, urgently. I am coming, I cried. Wait for me. Oh, I will come. I flew to the door and looked into the passage. It was dark. I ran out into the garden. It was void. Where are you? I exclaimed. The hills beyond March Glen sent the answer faintly back. Where are you? I listened. The wind sighed low in the firs. All was moorland, loneliness, at midnight hush. Down superstition, I commented, as that spectre rose up, black by the black hue at the gate. This is not thy deception, nor thy witchcraft. It is the work of nature. She was roused and did no miracle, but her best. I broke from St. John, who had followed, and would have detained me. It was my time to assume ascendancy. My powers were in play, and in force. I told him to forbear question or remark. I desired him to leave me. I must and would be alone. He obeyed at once. Where there is energy to command well enough, obedience never fails. I mounted to my chamber, locked myself in, fell on my knees, and prayed in my way, a different way to St. John's, but effective in its own fashion. I seemed to penetrate very near a mighty spirit, and my soul rushed out in gratitude at his feet. I rose from the thanksgiving, took a resolve, and lay down, unscared, enlightened, eager but for the daylight. Chapter inspiration. The wondrous shock of feeling had come like the earthquake which shook the foundations of Paul and Silas's prison. It had opened the doors of the soul's cell and loosed its bands. It had wakened it out of its sleep, whence it sprang, trembling, listening, aghast, then vibrated thrice a cry on my startled ear, and in my quaking heart, and through my spirit, which neither feared nor shook, but exulted, as if in joy over the success of one effort it had been privileged to make independent of the cumbrous body. Ere many days, I said, as I terminated my musings, I will know something of him whose voice seemed last night to summon me. Letters have proved of no avail. Personal inquiry shall replace them. At breakfast, I announced to Diana and Mary that I was going a journey, and should be absent at least 4 days. Alone, Jane? They asked. Yes, it was to see or hear news of a friend, about whom I had for some time been uneasy. They might have said, as I have no doubt they thought, that they had believed me to be without any friends, save them, for indeed I had often said so, but with their natural delicacy they abstained from comment, except that Diana asked me if I was sure I was well enough to travel. I looked very pale, she observed. I replied that nothing ailed me save anxiety of mind, which I hoped soon to alleviate. It was easy to make my further arrangements, for I was troubled with no inquiries, no surmises. Having once explained to them that I could not now be explicit about my plans, they kindly and wisely acquiesced in the silence with which I pursued them. According to me, the privilege of free action I should under similar circumstances have accorded them. I left Morehouse at 3 o'clock p.m., and soon after 4 I stood at the foot of the signpost of Whitecross, waiting the arrival of the coach which was to take me to distant Thornfield. Amidst the silence of those solitary roads and desert hills, I heard it approach from a great distance. It was the same vehicle whence, a year ago, I had alighted one summer evening on this very spot. How desolate and hopeless and objectless! It stopped as I beckoned. I entered, not now obliged to part with my whole fortune as the price of its accommodation. Once more on the road to Thornfield, I felt like the messenger pigeon flying home. It was a journey of 36 hours. I had set out from Whitecross on a Tuesday afternoon, and early on the succeeding Thursday morning, the coach stopped to water the horses at a wayside inn, situated in the midst of scenery, whose green hedges and large fields, and low pastoral hills, a mild of feature and verdant of hue, compared with the stern North Midland moors of Morton, met my eye like the lineaments of a once familiar face. Yes, I knew the character of this landscape. I was sure we were near Mybourne. How far is Thornfield Hall from here? I asked of the ostler. Just 2 miles, ma'am, across the fields. My journey is closed, I thought to myself. I got out of the coach, gave a box I had into the ostler's charge, to be kept till I called for it, paid my fare, satisfied the coachman, and was going. The brightening day gleamed on the sign of this inn, and I read in gilt letters, "The Rochester Arms." My heart leapt up. I was already on my master's very lands. It fell again. The thought struck it. Your master himself may be beyond the British Channel, for aught you know, and then, if he is at Thornfield Hall, towards which you hasten, who besides him is there? His lunatic wife, and you have nothing to do with him. You dare not speak to him, or seek his presence. You have lost your labour. You had better go no farther, urged the monitor. Ask information of the people at the inn. They can give you all you seek. They can solve your doubts at once. Go up despair. To prolong doubt was to prolong hope. I might yet, once more, see the hall under the ray of her star. There was the stile before me, the very fields through which I had hurried, blind, deaf, distracted with a revengeful fury, tracking and scourging me on the morning I fled from Thornfield. Ere I well knew what course I had resolved to take, I was in the midst of them. How fast I walked, how I ran sometimes, how I looked forward to catch the first view of the well-known woods, with what feelings I welcomed single trees I knew, and familiar glimpses of meadow and hill between them. At last the woods rose. The rookery clustered dark. A loud cawing broke the morning stillness. Strange delight inspired me. On I hastened. Another field crossed, a lane threaded, and there were the courtyard walls, the back offices, the house itself, the rookery still hid. My first view of it shall be the front, I determined, where its bold battlements will strike the eye nobly at once, and where I can single out my master's very window. Perhaps he will be standing at it. He rises early. Perhaps he is now walking in the orchard, or on the pavement in front. But could I but see him, surely in that case I should not be so mad as to run to him. I cannot tell. I am not certain. And if I did, what then? God bless him. What then? Who would be hurt by my once more tasting the life as his glance can give me? I rave. Perhaps at this moment he is watching the sunrise over the Pyrenees, or on the tideless sea of the south. I had coasted along on the lower wall of the orchard, turned its angle. There was a gate just there, opening into the meadow, between two stone pillars crowned by stone balls. From behind one pillar, I could peep round quietly at the full front of the mansion. I advanced my head with precaution, desirous to ascertain if any bedroom window blinds were yet drawn up. Battlements, windows, long front, all from this sheltered station were at my command. The crows sailing overhead, perhaps, watched me while I took this survey. I wonder what they thought. They must have considered I was very careful and timid at first, and gradually I grew very bold and reckless. A peep, and then a long stare, and then a departure from my niche, and a straying out into the meadow, and a sudden stop full in front of the great mansion, and a protracted, hardy gaze towards it. What affection of diffidence was this at first? They might have demanded. What stupid regardlessness now? Here an illustration, reader. A lover finds his mistress asleep on a mossy bank. He wishes to catch a glimpse of her fair face without waking her. He steals softly over the grass, careful to make no sound. He pauses, fancying she has stirred. He withdraws. Not for worlds would he be seen. All is still. He again advances. He bends above her. A light veil rests on her features. He lifts it, bends lower. Now his eyes anticipate the vision of beauty, warm and blooming and lovely in rest. How hurried was their first glance, but how they fix, how he starts, how he suddenly and vehemently clasps in both arms the form he dared not, a moment since, touch with his finger. How he calls aloud a name, and drops his burden, and gazes on it wildly. He thus grasps and cries, and gazes because he no longer fears to waken by any sound he can utter, by any movement he can make. He thought his love slept sweetly. He finds she is stone dead. I looked with timorous joy towards the stately house. I saw a blackened ruin. No need to cower behind a gate post. No need to cower behind a gate post, indeed. To peep up at chamber lattices, fear and life was astir behind them. No need to listen for doors opening, to fancy steps on the pavements or the gravel walk. The lawn rushed in. And there was the silence of death about it, the solitude of a lonesome wild. No wonder that letters addressed to people here had never received an answer. As well dispatch epistles to a vault in a church aisle. The grim blackness of the stones told by what fate the hall had befallen, by conflagration. But how kindled? What story belonged to this disaster? What loss, besides mortar and marble and woodwork, had followed upon it? Had life been wrecked as well as property? If so, whose? Dreadful question. There was no one here to answer it, not even dumb sign, mute token. In wandering round the shattered walls and through the devastated interior, I gathered evidence that the calamity was not of late occurrence. Winter snows, I thought, had drifted through that void arch. Winter rains beaten in at those hollow casements. For, amidst the drenched piles of rubbish, spring had cherished vegetation. Grass and weed grew here and there, between the stones and fallen rafters. And oh, where meantime was the hapless owner of this wreck? In what land? Under what auspices? My eye involuntarily wandered to the grey church tower near the gates, and I asked, is he with Demer de Rochester, sharing the shelter of his narrow marble house? Some answer must be had to these questions. I could find it nowhere but at the inn, and thither, ere long, I had returned. The host himself brought my breakfast into the parlour. I requested him to shut the door and sit down. I had some questions to ask, but when he complied, I scarcely knew how to begin. Such horror had I of the possible answers, and yet the spectacle of desolation I had just left prepared me in a measure for a tale of misery. The host was a respectable-looking, middle-aged man. You know Thornfield Hall, of course, I managed to say at last. Yes, ma'am, I lived there once. Did you? Not in my time, I thought. You are a stranger to me. I was the late Mr. Rochester's butler, he added. The late. I seem to have received with full force the blow I had been trying to evade. The late, I gasped. Is he dead? I mean the present gentleman, Mr. Edward's father, he explained. I breathed again. My blood resumed its flow, fully assured by these words that Mr. Edward, my Mr. Rochester, God bless him, wherever he was at least alive, was, in short, the present gentleman. Gladdening words. It seemed I could hear all that was to come, whatever the disclosure might be, with comparative tranquillity, since he was not in the grave. I could bear, I thought, to learn that he was at the antipodes. Is Mr. Rochester living at Thornfield Hall now? I asked, knowing, of course, what the answer would be, but yet desirous of deferring the direct questions as to where he really was. No, ma'am. Oh, no. No one is living there. I suppose you are a stranger in these parts, or you would have heard what happened last autumn. Thornfield Hall is quite a ruin. It was burnt down just about harvest time. A dreadful calamity, such an immense quantity of valuable property destroyed. Hardly any of the furniture could be saved. The fire broke out at dead of night, and before the engines arrived from Millcote, the building was one mass of flames. It was a terrible spectacle. I witnessed it myself. At dead of night, I muttered. Yes, that was ever the hour of fatality at Thornfield. Was it known how it originated? I demanded. They guessed, ma'am, they guessed. Indeed, I should say it was ascertained beyond a doubt. You are not perhaps aware, he continued, edging his chair a little nearer the table and speaking low, that there was a lady, a lunatic, kept in the house. I have heard something of it. She was kept in very close confinement, ma'am. People, even for some years, were not absolutely certain of her existence. No one saw her. They only knew by rumour that such person was at the hall, and who or what she was, it was difficult to conjecture. They said Mr. Edward had brought her from abroad, and some believed she had been his mistress. But a queer thing happened a year since. A very queer thing. I feared now to hear my own story. I endeavoured to recall him to the main fact. And this lady, ma'am, he answered, turned out to be Mrs. Rochester's wife. The discovery was brought about in the strangest way. There was a young lady, a governess at the hall, that Mr. Rochester fell in. But the fire, I suggested. I am coming to that, ma'am. That Mr. Edward fell in love with. The servants say they never saw anybody so much in love as he was. He was after her continually. They used to watch him, servants will, you know, ma'am, and he set store on her past everything. For all, nobody but him thought her so very handsome. She was a little small thing, they say, almost like a child. I never saw her myself, but I've heard Leah, the housemaid, tell of her. Leah liked her well enough. Mr. Rochester was about 40, and this governess not 20. And you see, when gentlemen of this age fall in love with girls, they are often like as if they were bewitched. Well, he would marry her. You shall tell me this part of the story another time, I said, but now I have a particular reason for wishing to hear about the fire. Was it suspected that this lunatic, Mrs. Rochester, had any hand in it? You've hit it, ma'am. It's quite certain that it was her, and nobody but her that set it going. She had a woman to take care of her called Mrs. Poole, an able woman in her line, and very trustworthy, but for one fault, a fault common to a deal of them nurses and matrons. She kept a private bottle of gin by her, and now and then took a drop overmuch. It is excusable, for she had a hard life of it, but it still was dangerous, for when Mrs. Poole was fast asleep after the gin and water, the mad lady, who was as cunning as a witch, would take the keys out of her pocket, let herself out of her chamber, and go roaming about the house, doing any wild mischief that came into her head. They say she had nearly burnt her husband in his bed once, but I don't know about that. However, on this night, she set fire first to the hangings of the room next to her own, and then she got down to a lower story, and made her way to the chamber that had been the governess's. She was like as if she knew somehow how matters had gone on, and had espied her, and she kindled the bed there, but there was nobody sleeping in it, fortunately. The governess had run away 2 months before, and for all Mr. Rochester sought her, as if she had been the most precious thing he had in the world, he never could hear a word of her, and he grew savage, quite savage in his disappointment. He never was a mild man, but he got dangerous after he lost her. He would be alone too. He sent Mrs. Fairfax, the housekeeper, away to her friends at a distance, but he did it handsomely, for he settled an annuity on her for life, and she deserved it, for she was a very good woman. Miss Adele, a ward he had, was put to school. He broke off acquaintance with all the gentry, and shut himself up like a hermit at the hall. What, did he not leave England? Leave England? Bless you, no. He would not cross the doorstones of the house, except at night, when he walked just like a ghost about the grounds and in the orchard, as if he had lost his senses, which it is my opinion he had, for a more spirited, bolder, keener gentleman than he was before that midge of a governess crossed him, you never saw, ma'am. He was not a man given to wine or cards or racing, as some are, and he was not so very handsome, but he had courage and a will of his own, if ever man had. I knew him from a boy, you see, and for my part, I have often wished that Miss Eyre had been sunk in the sea before she came to Thornfield Hall. That Mr. Rochester was at home when the fire broke out. Yes, indeed was he, and he went up to the attic when all was burning above and below, and got the servants out of the beds, and helped them down himself, and went back to get his mad wife out. Dead. Dead, aye, dead as the stones in which her brains and blood were scattered. Good God! You may well say so, ma'am. It was frightful. He shuddered. And afterwards, I urged, well, ma'am, afterwards, the house was burnt to the ground. There are only some bits of walls standing now. Were any other lives lost? No. Perhaps it would have been better if there had. What do you mean? Poor Mr. Edward, he ejaculated. I little thought ever to have seen it. Some say it was a just judgment on him for keeping his first marriage secret, and wanting to take another wife while he had one living. But I pity him, for my part. You said he was alive, I exclaimed. Yes, he is alive, but many think he had better be dead. Why? How? My blood was again running cold. Where is he? I demanded. Is he in England? Aye, he's in England. He can't get out of England, I fancy. He's a fixture now. What agony was this? And the man seemed resolved to protract it. He is stone blind, he said at last. Yes, he is stone blind, is Mr. Edward. I had dreaded worse. I had dreaded he was mad. I summoned strength to ask what had caused this calamity. It was all his own courage, and a body may say his kindness, in a way, ma'am. He wouldn't leave the house till everyone else was out before him. As he came down the great staircase at last, after Mrs. Rochester had flung herself from the battlements, there was a great crash. All fell. He was taken out from under the ruins, alive, but sadly hurt. A beam had fallen in such a way as to protect him partly, but one eye was knocked out, and one hand so crushed that Mr. Carter, the surgeon, had to amputate it directly. The other eye inflamed. He lost the sight of that also. He is now helpless indeed, blind and a cripple. Where is he? Where does he now live? At Ferndene, a manor house on a farm he has, about 30 miles off. Quite a desolate spot. Who is with him? Old John and his wife. He would have none else. He is quite broken down, they say. Have you any sort of conveyance? We have a chaise, ma'am, a very handsome chaise. Let it be got ready instantly, and if your postboy can drive me to Ferndene before dark this day, I'll pay both you and him twice the hire you usually